we have an impressive number of people joining us already and a few more trickling in, so we'll get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. It's great to see such a strong turnout. We're ticking up towards 200 people here already. My name is Shannon Dobb, and I'm the BC Director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives in British Columbia. And I'm joining you today from the unceded territory of the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish Nations, where the CCPA BC office is also located. We're here to launch an important new paper from the Powershare Project, written by Jim Stanford and Daniel Poon, on the importance of strengthening channels of workers' voice as Canadian workplaces confront big challenges in the future of work: technology, gig work, climate change, and many others. The full report, called Speaking Out, Being Heard, Making Change, is available on the Centre for Future Work website at centreforfuturework.ca. And it was also covered in a great feature article in the Toronto Star that some of you have perhaps seen already today. Powershare is a project that is led by the Centre for Future Work with the participation of the CCPA and the Atkinson Foundation. And I'd like to thank the Atkinson Foundation for their involvement today in today's event. In a moment, we're going to hear a presentation on the paper and hear a couple of concrete examples about how strong voice can make a real difference in workers' lives. I'm pleased to now introduce Jim Stanford. He's an economist and the director of the Centre for Future Work, known to many of you from his years working as a union economist and a CCPA research associate, and he is one of the authors of the report. Over to you, Jim.
Shannon, thank you very much. And thank you very much to everyone out there for joining us today. So glad to have you as part of this discussion. Really excited at the interest in this report. Great story in the Toronto Star. That was wonderful. I did note, with some chagrin this morning, actually, when I opened the Star article, I'm actually wearing exactly the same shirt and exactly the same tie today as I was in the picture that ran in the story. So that's a little bit embarrassing. But I do want to stress that I am doing my laundry, and I stress that because I think my mother is on the call today as well. So Mom, yes, I do wash my clothes. I am going to get through, go through a presentation on the highlights of the report and everything. But before I go to the slides and all that, I do want to acknowledge and thank my co-author, Daniel Poon, who's with us today. It was great working with Daniel on this. He brought so much to the report. And Dan, why don't you just say a few words to the audience?
Sure. Hi, everyone from the West Coast. I just want to take a moment to express my thanks to Jim, the Center for Future Work, and the project funders for the chance to partake in this important and timely research. Just to say, with much recent talk of some kind of New Deal in response to the economic fallout from the COVID pandemic, it's no coincidence, perhaps, that the issue of worker voice is gaining prominence as a key public policy priority, both at home and abroad. In this context, the paper couldn't come at a better time. In analyzing Canada's institutional settings and policy options going forward, as Jim will further elaborate. Thank you, Jim. Back to you.
Awesome, Dan. Thank you. Thank you again for partnering on this project. Okay, so I'm going to share some slides. It'll take probably about 25 or 30 minutes to run through the highlights of the report, and then we're going to hear from a couple of other speakers, and then some Q&A, and we'll finish it all up within an hour. So I am sharing the slides now. Dan, give me a thumbs up if you see the cover slide okay there, do you? Excellent. Okay, thank you. So speaking out, being heard, making change. I also want to thank the CCPA and the Atkinson Foundation for partnering with us on this Powershare project. This is the second major paper released through the Powershare project, and we'll have a few more over the next couple of years, all of them looking at the balance of power in our labor market and how do we make it fairer and safer and more sustainable. And part of that is, of course, making sure that working people have the power to express their ideas and their needs and their preferences, which is what this is all about. There's the center's website. The paper is there. There's also the URL for the paper itself. And then my Twitter handle and the center's Twitter handle. You're welcome to tweet or any other kind of social media from this presentation today as well. Every research project is a collective one, but I have to tell you, this one was a super collective research project. We drew on so many good ideas and references and links from just dozens of people. So I've added, just thrown up a lot of the names there, and very, very much I want to thank everyone who contributed to the report. This was definitely an exercise in collective voice, which is exactly what we're trying to accomplish. Why would we write a paper about voice? It seems like a bit of an abstract concept and a bit of a slippery concept in some ways. The reality is that we're facing some incredible changes in the world of work. And we know that. We see technology, automation, artificial intelligence. We see all the changes in business structure and business models, such as obviously digital platforms and gigs. We've got a whole energy and climate transition that's happening that we have to make sure we manage well in terms of the workplace and employment impacts of it. Other little things like pandemics and other challenges that are just disrupting how we've traditionally worked. And the reality is workers have to have more of a say in workplaces and how they adapt to those changes if we're going to succeed, if we're going to be as successful and sustainable and inclusive and effective as possible in adapting to those changes. The problem is the mechanisms of workers' voice in Canada are underdeveloped and they're getting weaker. Largely, I argue, because of the deunionization that we've been seeing, particularly in the private sector. So as a sort of foundational demand, the idea of strengthening workers' voice, I think, is an idea whose time has come. So what are we talking about when we even mention workers' voice? I mean, that is, in a way, a kind of an abstract idea, and it is a slippery term that gets used in different ways by different stakeholders. I'm tempted to say that voice is in the eye of the beholder, but that would go down in history as one of the worst mixed metaphors ever in literature, because of course, you hear a voice, you don't see it, but you get the point. How you understand voice and how you feel about workers' voice depends on where you're positioned in the workplace. And this is why we hear different visions of voice, depending on who we're talking to. Managers, at least the enlightened modern ones, will say that they believe in voice as well, but their idea of voice can be quite different from what the workers are hoping for and needing. Here's the simple definition, the sort of concrete definition of voice in the paper. It is the ability of workers individually and collectively to express their opinions and preferences regarding their jobs and workplaces, to protect themselves against unfair, unacceptable, dangerous conditions and decisions, and to advocate for desired change. Very important to stress up front that voice is not just venting. Okay, you're not just allowed to go out and rant and say, therefore, you've had a voice. And this is important to keep in mind these days when we can all rant on social media, and we do. Does that mean you have a voice? Not really. In general, you want to have some structure and channel that the voice is going to get heard through. You have to have a constructive intent. That is something that's going to happen as a result of the voice. It's not just to rant and feel better, and some reasonable prospect of actually making change from it. So in this regard, I think voice goes hand in hand with what we can call agency and power. It's hard to think of real, genuine voice without thinking of the ability to do something about it. If it's going to be more than just a venting session, more than just a complaint, then you have to have some kind of capacity or system or ability to try to act on your voice and bring about the change that you're seeking. And then you got to have some power in order to actually win some of the change that you're seeking. So I think those things go together. And if we're going to think about voice in a kind of a powerful, genuine way, we have to think of those that constructive intent and the ability that workers have or don't have to win the change that they're seeking. Another way to kind of drill down a bit and get to a sort of more genuine or meaningful kind of voice, understanding of voice, is to distinguish between different types of voice. So there's a discussion in the paper about the different ways that we can think of voice. Informal versus formal. An informal system of voice is just where people talk to each other, and sometimes the managers will listen to you. They may say that they've got an open door policy. They may have a suggestion box. Okay, those are kind of informal ways in which they can, if they're listening, hear the voices of workers and act on them. Alternatively, a formal structure of voice means you've got actual channels of communication and accountability so that you know the voice will be heard and has to be responded to in some way. Another distinction is between individual voice and collective voice. An individual system means each individual worker is going to go up and say, to their manager what they feel about something, or express their needs. And again, that could be one-on-one through the manager's open door policy or other channels of individualized communication. On the other hand, collective voice is where the workers as a whole have the ability to come together, marshal their ideas, and express their views as one. And that's obviously a lot more powerful and frankly, a lot more threatening to the unilateral power of managers. So managers are often interested in hearing from the workers, but usually one-on-one. Another distinction is between direct voice and indirect voice. Direct voice is where some workplaces will give individuals or small groups of workers direct control over certain types of decisions, say in a team setting within some workplaces, even around issues like, what order they do the tasks in or what time they're going to take lunch. Indirect voice is where you're electing representatives. It's like a kind of a representative form of government in a way to take the workers' collective concerns and go forward with them. So indirect systems generally go hand in hand with a collective and more formal vision of voice. Another distinction you could make is between promotive or prohibitive voice. Promotive voice is where the workers are saying they want something. A prohibitive voice is where the workers are saying they aren't going to tolerate or aren't going to accept something. In other words, vetoing something that management is trying to do. Both are important in a well-rounded system of voice, but you can see that prohibitive voice poses the more direct challenge to management authority. Finally, another distinction, a very important one between employer-led visions of voice and worker-led visions of voice. As I mentioned, many employers, especially the more enlightened ones, will recognize they've got to create a team attitude in the workplace. They've got to listen to people. They've got to communicate with people. But if it's always employer-led, they can determine when and how the voice is heard, what questions the workers are asked, and of course, what, if anything, is done with the input they receive from the workers. And I'm not saying that employer-led systems are useless, but I am saying that they're constrained and they're inherently limited because managers will accept the input that they think benefits the firm in terms of its productivity and profitability benchmarks and so on. Worker-led voice means the workers have autonomy and control over what is said and how it is said, and presumably some kind of capacity to act on it. So if you were going to think of a more genuine form of voice, rather than a kind of a buzzword HR kind of slogan, you'd be looking for voice where the workers have autonomy and control over how the voice is expressed, where it's safe for workers to express voice, free from fear of reprisal or dismissal or missing a promotion because they spoke out at work. Transparency and reliability in the mechanisms of voice, so you know that they're there. It doesn't just depend on the subjective attitude of a manager. The potential for workers to come together and express a collective voice, and of course the prospect of being heard and responded to. Workers' voice can operate on different levels, and I do want to mention I'm indebted to my co-author Dan Poon for this insight. That's part of our paper. We call it the micro level, the meso level, and the macro level. We often think about voice being expressed within workplaces, obviously, and the issues that are specific to workplaces, but that isn't the only place where voice can make a difference. Also important at the industry or occupational level, where you're thinking about things like training, say, or health and safety rules, or innovation strategies, or government incentives for businesses, other things where you would operate at a multi-firm level within your industry or occupation. And at the macro level, workers need a strong voice as well to influence the broad economic and social policies that are crucial to the conditions and experiences of workers. So we need voice at all levels, and they're very interdependent. If workers are very strong in the workplace, then they're going to have much more capacity to influence decisions at the meso and macro levels as well. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how do we understand voice and why do we think it matters? And this is where we have to delve a little bit into the realm of theory. And I don't want to go too deep here, but it does inform our argument as to why voice is a matter of significance and why we're concerned with it and why we might want to strengthen it. In an orthodox neoclassical vision of economics, for those that have had to study at a university, at a college, at Economics 101 and seen the miracle of supply and demand, there actually isn't a need for voice. There's no reason to even think that voice exists, let alone that it matters. So if we look at the kind of very traditional economic theory of the labor market, you've got a supply curve of workers who want to work. You've got a demand curve from employers who want to hire them to work. You've got some kind of point of nirvana or bliss or ecstasy or something where supply and demand meet. And at that point, the market is going to determine a wage level that makes sense based on the productivity of the workers. It's automatic and perfectly tied to productivity. And they're going to ensure that every willing worker is employed in some productive vocation. So you're at a situation of full employment. In this situation of supply equals demand and wages are determined by the market forces and marginal productivity, voice isn't even in the picture. It's not even on the radar screen. If you weren't treated well in a workplace, all you would have to do is quit and walk out the door and instantly get hired into another job that paid exactly the same. That's how the labor market is assumed to work. And of course, that bears no reality to, or no relationship to reality. I mean, can you even imagine if that's what the economy was like? What kind of chaos would break out in the workplace when every asshole boss came along and everyone would just walk out the door and say, I'm going to the one next door where I get paid exactly the same and I don't have to deal with you. So obviously that has no relationship to reality, and it's not very useful for explaining how the labor market really works, why we have unemployment, for example, why we have wage differentials, why managers put so much attention and thought into HR strategies and so on. Well, some clever and well-meaning people came along and tweaked the neoclassical model. And I'm drawing here on the classic and very influential work of Freeman and Medoff in the 1980s, who developed a theory of voice in the workplace and explained why it would matter, contrary to the assumptions of the traditional neoclassical model, which, by the way, they accepted. That was their view of the world as well. But they said, look, it's not as perfect as it looks. And they added some imperfections to the theory, including the fact that it's costly and risky to quit your job and go somewhere else. And you have imperfect information about what the other job might be like. Who knows? Your new boss might be even more of an asshole than the one you quit. So in that case, people are reluctant to change jobs as easily as the traditional theory implies. And in this case, they explain why it matters and it's meaningful and it's productive to have a voice within a workplace. They actually drew a contrast between your voice, which is your ability to express your opinions and try to bring about change, or your power to exit, to quit and go somewhere else. And in many cases, it's more efficient and better for both the employer and the worker to use the voice. And this is why they argued that internal voice was beneficial. And they also argued, contrary to traditional neoclassical thinkers, that unions could be beneficial because they provided formal, reliable channels of collective voice and could thereby foster better communication, better retention, better productivity, and so on. We owe a lot to Freeman and Medoff's model, but their approach was very, very cautious and very, very incremental, including their treatment of unions. They still accepted that unions were distortionary in their efforts to push up wages and that was bad. But they said under certain circumstances, the benefits of unions in facilitating voice could outweigh those costs. So they were a bit softer on unions, if you like. I think there's actually, we don't even have to tweak the neoclassical model. We can just throw it out. Because it really bears no relationship to reality. And in contrast to the sort of perfect competition, supply equals demand vision, they're missing the fact that power is a normal determinant, a normal feature of all workplaces, not just ones where there's a union. If there is no union, there's still power there. It's just an enormously unbalanced power relationship that's there as a matter of course. So you can't assume that the wage or employment outcomes are optimal in the first place. And in that case, if you build organized workers' voice and the capacity to offset or be a countervailing force to the normal natural power of employers, then you can achieve better outcomes on both axes, if you like. You can have better voice and efficiency and retention and productivity, and you can also get fairer sharing of the pie. And I think this is, in a way, the more realistic and comprehensive vision. And it helps to explain why there are so many different benefits of voice that the economic research has identified at the level of the firm, at the level of workers individually, obviously, in terms of their satisfaction, retention, productivity, even at the macro level in terms of equality, a more inclusive economy, and better health and safety outcomes. So all kinds of reasons that voice matters. for workers, for workplaces, and for society. Some fascinating research in that section of the report. Just some of the interesting new findings, the impact of workplace voice on democracy, because people get practice at democracy in a workplace where voice is respected and operates. The evidence shows that they participate more fully and effectively in political democracy in society. Moreover, when workers are empowered with voice in the workplace, their elected representatives tend to be more accountable to all of society rather than to the vested interests of big business and investors and so on. Another fascinating finding recently from the US, workplaces that have channels, organized channels of voice, demonstrate less intense racial divisions among the workers there, because they've got channels to talk to each other and learn from each other and respect each other. And that is obviously beneficial for society as a whole. Now, how does voice actually work? How is it operationalized? The paper goes through 4 broad categories of the different ways that you can see voice working in workplaces and in the economy. Union-led voice, where there's a union and a collective agreement. Employer-led voice, where they're making efforts from the top, if you like, sometimes very token efforts, sometimes more meaningful, to have channels of voice. Statutory voice is a system of voice where the government requires it, and therefore workplaces are required to set up these channels. And then additional strategies, community and informal strategies that we'll talk about a little bit. Let's start with union-led forms of voice. There's again an interesting kind of dialogue going on within the whole, labor relations, human resources world about what voice is. And some management gurus will be tempted to see voice as an alternative to unionization. They often promote this as a way of union avoidance, in fact, coaching managers to, talk to your workers, invite them in, be nice to them, and that way you'll forestall any union campaigns. That I think is wrong to see them as, in a way, substitutes or opposites. I think they're complements. In general, a voice is more robust and stronger, more transparent, and more reliable in workplaces where you have a collective agreement and the institutional embeddedness of voice that comes with a well-developed unionized workplace. So I think by and large, unions and voice go together, not perfectly, as I'll explain. But in this regard, we're already seeing some important policy implications. The future of voice in Canada's economy is very much tied up with the future of union. Not one-to-one, it's not a perfect overlap, but if unions, particularly in the private sector, are going to continue to lose their foothold in the economy, then the outlook for serious, genuine workers' voice is going to be difficult indeed. So this is the graph that keeps me up at night. On the whole, Canadian unions have done a good job at keeping their foothold in society. Union density has eroded, but very slowly in Canada. And we've done better than most countries in that regard. But there's a huge distinction between the private sector and the public sector on this. And private sector unionization has declined pretty steadily over the last generation, from about 1 in 4 workers in the early 1990s to about 1 in 6 today. And this is, I think, again, a reason why targeting voice and strategies to strengthen voice is going to be so important. Now, I said that unions and voice go together, but not perfectly. I'm going to draw a little Venn diagram here, okay? So this is high tech, I tell you, a Venn diagram where there's a lot of overlap between unions and voice, but not perfect overlap. So unions represent about 30% of Canadian workers. And where you've got strong voice in a union setting, then you've got a very strong level of union voice. And it is the most important and most robust way. On the other hand, there are ways that you can have genuine voice without a union. And we should talk about those and talk about the possibilities, but also the limitations. And we have to be honest, there are unionized workplaces where structures of voice are not well developed and not well respected. Where workers in those workplaces don't feel that they have a voice, even though the place is unionized, and they may be benefiting from the union in the form of higher wages and benefits and so on. But in terms of those goals of workplace voice, they're not necessarily there. So there's a strong overlap, but not a perfect overlap. And then, of course, there's a large group of workers who have no voice and no union either. And that's the group that really we have to think about, how do we get them some say and some respect and some power. One of my favorite parts of this whole report, to be honest, and I know I'm a bit of a nerd with the charts, is table 2. Go to page 51 and look at table 2 when you get a chance. And this is a great big table that contains a whole bunch of different ways, over 40 in fact, organized into 8 categories, about how voice can be built and sustained and developed in a unionized setting. All kinds of them, including obviously workplace representation. That's as bare bones voice as you can get. The fact you've got a steward to talk to you and go with you to the boss and protect you. Collective bargaining, where you formally as workers get to put forward proposals and demands and hear management's response and try and hash it out with them. Health and safety, obviously, work organization, things like shifts and breaks and pace of work, employment standards. One of the big benefits of unions, ironically, is to make sure that minimum labor standards, which supposedly apply to everyone, are respected, because they aren't necessarily respected in places that workers don't have voice. All kinds of issues, including at the meso and macro level. And then a whole other category, which is being involved in the union. That itself is a form of voice and a way of having agency and bringing about change in your workplace and in your life. Unionized workplaces, as I say, are very comprehensive. A very well-developed union workplace has got dozens and dozens of different ways that workers can speak out, get involved, and try to bring about change. Those are not the only circumstances, though. There are employer-led systems of voice. Usually, they're quite informal and subject to the attitudes and priorities that management sets. Sometimes they're more formal. The paper talks about things like the joint industrial committees that were once common at a company like Imperial Oil, or Magna and its fair enterprise model. Those are relatively developed structures of employer-led voice. And we have to take them seriously. We can't just write them off, but they are constrained in terms of how they operate and how much agency they have. And that's why at both Imperial Oil and Magna, many workers have said, no, we actually want to join the union and get a full system of voice. Statutory voice, as I mentioned, is where the government requires employers to set up methods of voice. This is, of course, very well developed in Western Europe with things like the works councils in Germany and other countries, or the co-determination system, where it's just considered a basic feature of democracy that workers have a say in their workplace. Go figure. What a radical concept. Normally, in our world, democracy stops at the door when you get to work, doesn't it? But in Europe, it's considered a basic right. This is rare in North America and in Canada. There's an important exception in Canada. That's the mandated voice systems that are established in health and safety areas, including mandatory joint health and safety committees in any workplaces over 20 workers, and other targeted areas as well. And we talk in the paper that could actually be a model for expanding worker voice to other areas, statutory worker voice. I think the same argument, the same logic, that it's so important to society as a whole that workplaces are safe. That's what justifies the government stepping in and saying, you must, employer, you must set up a joint health and safety committee. You could do exactly the same argument around training and skills, for example, or around technology and innovation, or around racial and gender harassment at the workplace. These are, I think, potential areas where the principle of statutory voice could be expanded. Other strategies using community organizing, for example, and we'll hear from one example of that later in this webinar, or NGOs, supply chain monitoring, other ways that communities of people try to impose some accountability on employers and lift the voices of workers who might not get heard otherwise. Those, I think, are very inspiring. On the other hand, experience shows you really want to somehow embed those outside community initiatives to give them more power and more stability. Now, the purpose of our paper was not just to kind of go through the theory and practice of voice per se, as we've done. It was also to discuss why we think voice is going to be even more important in the future. We are the Center for Future Work. So we are thinking about how is this going to change and why does voice matter in the future of work, and consider ways to strengthen. So the last few minutes of my presentation will go through some of the ways that voice, I think, will be more important in the future than it was in the past. Technology, a no-brainer. Technology is not an exogenous force. We have choices to make about how technology is applied and how the costs and benefits are shared. And workers' voice is going to be important in shaping those choices. Technology workers know it. There was a poll that came out the other day. 78% of high-tech workers think tech companies are too powerful. And that includes the fact that they don't have enough voice in their own workplace. Health and safety has always been a big priority for organized voice. And of course, the pandemic and all the new challenges that it raises are going to be critical. And the experience shows if workers don't have power in the workplace, representation in the workplace, knowledge in the workplace, employers will get away with the bare minimum. They'll go through the COVID theater, they'll put out bottles of hand sanitizer, and then they'll blame the victim when they get sick. And we saw that with Amazon and their warehouse and their horrific practices. Getting a union and a voice is the first way to protecting those workers and everyone else. We've got this enormous energy transition coming, and we've done work at the center to say this isn't a bad thing for employment. If it's managed well, it can be a good thing for employment. But workers have to have a voice here too, in terms of learning about the transitions that are coming and putting up their priorities for how to manage that transition the best. Equality and fighting racism and sexism and other forms of inequality in the workplace, obviously a defining issue of our time. We've got tremendous struggles underway right now against racism, and the workplace is a place where those struggles have to be visible and powerful, and we need voice to do that. And we'll hear from Christine Macklin about one initiative in that regard in a couple of minutes. Working from home, there's over 5 million Canadians working from home right now because of the pandemic. That will decline when the economy reopens, but it won't get back to where it was before. All kinds of big issues about working from home and how we make sure it's fair and supported and sustainable. And I read Howard Levitt. Yes, do any of you read the Howard Levitt column in the National Post? He's an employer side lawyer, infuriating at times, but you'll always learn from him because you learn where the employers are coming. Read his column from Saturday. He's got a list of what they're coming after on the working from home issue, and it absolutely proves why we're going to need strong voice on those issues. I think workers' voice is important in the world of self-employment. I know that sounds like a contradiction in terms. You know, you're your own boss. What do you need a voice for? But the reality is, in Canada's history, we've had all kinds of times that self-employed people got together, whether it was farmers or fishers or foresters or truckers, to express their voice and negotiate collectively with the people that they deal with, whether it's buyers or sellers or governments. And they need voice. And the modern self-employed of today need voice too. Of course, the gig workers we know absolutely need a voice. They're an extreme example of insecure pseudo self-employment. We know they aren't actually self-employed, they're actually employed, and the companies like Uber are misclassifying them. But they need a voice that can be heard and power to win important reforms. I think there's actually an important area for expanding and strengthening voice just in small business generally, not just self-employment, but about 30% of Canadian workers, employees, are in firms or enterprises under 30 people. And those enterprises are have the least developed structures of voice. You've often got a paternalistic manager who figures, well, we're all part of the family. But that only goes so far, as we know. And I think we're going to need a strategy about training and empowering workers in small businesses to be their own advocates and stand up for basic principles and fair treatment. Social media, of course, is an enormous area. We all have a voice through social media, but it's fraught, including the risk that you can get fired. You absolutely can get fired for saying something about your boss on social media, especially if you're a non-union worker, then you don't have the protection of just cause. And obviously great potential to use social media as an organizing tool. The last one I mentioned in the paper is income support and things like employment insurance. We're going through huge changes in this right now, badly needed changes in Canada. We have to make sure we get it right, and we have to make sure that workers know what benefits they're entitled to. There's a micro level to this issue as well as a macro level, where having, say, informed advocates to help people put in their EI claims and so on will be important. Those are just, that's a kind of a smorgasbord of 10 ways I think voice is going to be more important in the future, even than it is now, and why we need to strengthen workers' voice. So the last section has an agenda of 8, and I consider this a start. I don't consider this the complete list. I consider this a start of 8 concrete ways that we could strengthen and expand voice. And there's kind of 2 categories here. I mentioned there's a big overlap between unions and voice, and there is. So part of protecting and strengthening voice is going to be strengthening unions, especially, as I said, in the private sector. Part of it is also going to be taking the benefits of a union style voice and taking it to the rest of the workforce. Things that union members take for granted, like the fact that you can't just be fired on short notice because the boss doesn't like you, okay? And offering those protections to the majority of workers who don't have the protection of a collective agreement, and other ways of extending some of those basic principles of voice elsewhere. I'll just mention one that I'm kind of intrigued with, and I'm interested to think about it, and that's this number 4. How do we expand statutory voice and co-determination? We're not going to snap our fingers and suddenly get works councils, okay? But the precedent set by the Health and Safety Joint Committees, I think, is a really important one, because it says that where there's a social interest in improving workplace practices, employers can and should be mandated to engage workers in formal, reliable, safe structures of voice and discussion and negotiation. And as I mentioned, I believe there's other topics to which that same principle could apply. And I would like to see us explore the idea of mandated joint committees in the areas of training and skills, technology, harassment or racism and sexism in workplaces, and other issues where there's clearly a social good to making sure that workers have the capacity to speak out. I know that was a rapid fire review. Please look at the paper and let the argument sink in a little bit more. Bottom line, there's a strong argument that voice matters, that strong voice makes for better jobs. It's good for workers, it's good for workplaces, and it's good for the overall economy. Our system of workers' voice in Canada, very underdeveloped, and it's eroding because of deunionization in the private sector. So finding ways that workers can have a say with a union or even without a union is, I think, going to be vital to the future quality of work. Now, we, of course, tried to illustrate the paper with 16 vignettes, we call them, 16 vignettes of voice in action. And this was our way of trying to make the whole discussion a bit less abstract and a bit more kind of concrete and real world. We found 16 great examples of groups in Canada that are finding creative and interesting ways to build voice and strengthen voice. And we've invited 2 of those examples to come with us on the webinar today to share their examples. And just remember, they're 2 of 16 fine examples, but I'm very grateful. First, I'm going to introduce Christine Macklin as the Human Rights Director at Unifor. Christine, thank you for what you're doing. And Christine has been leading up a fascinating program about voice for workers in the area of anti-racism. Christine, unmute yourself and tell us a little bit about what your project is trying to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I want to say thank you, but I would also like to acknowledge the land that I am currently on, which is Peterborough. It's under the Treaty 20, and it is the Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Ojibwe, Mississaugas of the Credit, and it is the Great Lakes Basin. And I want to give acknowledgement because I think what is so important about voice is that we always voice respect to the communities that have paved the way for us. So hi, I'm Christine Macklin. I'm the Unifor Human Rights Director. I actually came up through Unifor as an auto worker. And my father, it was a 38-year auto worker. And I'm gonna give just a little story before I get into the meat and potatoes, because I want you to know that the work that we're doing and the importance of voice being heard actually comes from lived experience. So my father was an auto worker for 38 years and went through the very many different company name changes and unions. And I remember a day when I worked in the assembly plant with him, and I got notification from a friend that my dad was in a disagreement in the men's change room because there were racial slurs and his bag was thrown outside of the change room. So as a faithful, loyal daughter, I went running down a block and a half of the assembly plant to get to my father. And when I got there, my father had dealt with it. He was on his way home. He never brought that up to the union. He never brought that up to the company. And that is the lived experience of many Black, Indigenous, and people of color in workplaces. And so I want you to know that the racial justice advocate language that I'm going to speak about is language that my father was able to see as 38 years before he passed, and knowing that his Black human rights director daughter had a part of that, and his union felt the importance to put that as a priority. I can't say to you more now than ever that those words are more than words in paper. They are the real changes that are needed, that come from voices being heard for change. And so I'm gonna dive into it because I really want us to talk about equity, inclusion, and diversity. But the racial justice advocate language was put in place because of racism. We recognize that the demographics in our workplaces are drastically changing. We may not see it currently in some sectors, but we know globally by population, by immigration, what is happening, that we need to stop referring to BIPOC people, Black, Indigenous, and people of color as minorities, because the reality is we are the global majority. And so when we're talking about racial equality and racial justice, it has to be forefront and interwoven with everything that we are doing about economic recovery. So the racial justice advocate really takes into consideration, we just bargained it in the big three, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, or FCA, and now we're getting other workplaces in healthcare and other sectors bargaining this historic language. And what it is it's a recognition that societal racism does not stop at the doors of our employment. I do not stop being a Black woman when I walk into my workplace. The racism that we saw in 2020 is not new. It was kind of interesting to see organizations and employers all of a sudden sending out these statements for Black Lives Matters and ending systemic racism, yet these are concerns and voices that have been raised through the history of time, because workplaces were actually created to use race and gender and other divides as a way to pay people less or to not pay people. Another thing about the racial justice advocate is about providing support. So it's not just about employment equity, about getting people into the workplaces and checking the box that, yes, we are employment equity and we're bargaining it even outside of federal employers. It's about, are we retaining and supporting equity seeking people, racialized people, our gender, all of the identities, are we supporting and retaining people? And the reality is there is a mass bleeding of diversity from many organizations. And to Jim's point, there was this idea that there's jobs out there, there's not. And people know that, but they're leaving employment because of discrimination and racism that they are facing. They are being devalued. They are not getting the mentorship. They're being set up for failure. There's no internal supports or networks. It's when people are dealing with racism and discrimination in their workplace, yep, it's bad that that person did that, but let's continue on. And that ongoing trauma has great impacts, and it is essential that employers take more of an aggressive step to address it, and unions are going to be essential about pushing for that change. It's about providing access to community culturally appropriate resources. And it's not just checking a box about, okay, we'll call your EFAP rep or call this outreach. We are culturally diverse. It's about working with leadership to develop and implement and monitor an anti-racism action program. That could be from hiring, that could be from the supports, that could be about addressing harassment, discrimination in the workplace. That could be about tracking, if you're in a unionized workplace, about who's getting disciplined, how, where, and why. Are racialized people being disciplined differently? And I come back to that scenario that I started off with. I think about, if I had got there and my dad was still in a confrontation, would he have been disciplined? Would I have been disciplined for leaving the assembly line because I went to my dad's defense? And I think about that, and the likelihood is yes. And I may not be sitting here as a human rights director if that was a result of what happened. Also looking at, what is the company and union jointly doing around anti-racism and discrimination? The union can put bargain language, can put ideas around employment equity reps, but the employer has to play a part of it. And we do need to have these continued conversations, not just at the bargaining table, but repeatedly coming together, readdressing what is happening in society and recognizing that it does come into our workplaces. And then we need to do some real networking with allies and community organizations that are doing the work, that are seeking employment, that are seeking these resources. We do not have to recreate this wheel. So the things that I just said are the things that we have bargained for our racial justice advocates in our workplaces as part of their job description. And I can tell just in the atmosphere that we're in, that this is going to be vitally changing, essential work that we can start to realize where we're at and where we can go, and we can listen to the voices. And so at Jim's presentation, I love the fact that you talked about the different voices. And I think it's essential that these advocates are identified as Black, Indigenous, or racialized. They have a good lived experience of dealing with racism. So there's a trust factor so that our members' voices can not only be heard at the employer level, but can also be held at our union level. And so I'm going to wrap it up because I could go on about equity and inclusion and diversity, but forever and always, but I want us to understand that there's a clear difference between diversity, which is the type of people that we have, and inclusion. Inclusion is about, do people feel respected, welcomed? Are their ideas heard? Are we being creative with the way we're doing things? And that is what is missing in a lot of organizations and a lot of workplaces. They check the box that we have 1 or 2 BIPOC members or LGBT members and think that they've got it. And so I have to say this as my final thought. People are tired about hearing about racism. Well, I know I'm tired of experiencing it. And the only way that we're going to end it is when I stop experiencing it, when other Black, Indigenous, and people of color with their diverse identities stop experiencing racism, then we can stop talking about it, then we can stop bargaining it, then we can stop doing everything. But as we know, we have to get that language bargain in order to make the real lasting change to hold employers accountable. So thank you so much for having me here.
Oh, Christine, that was awesome. Thank you very much for being here, and also for what you're doing to build this new channel of worker voice. So there is a sidebar, one of the vignettes in the paper that describes the Racial Justice Advocate Program that Christine and her colleagues negotiated. And please check that out. I think there's great applicability of that model for other issues and challenges. Okay, the second vignette that we have with us today in person, I would like to introduce Pam Charon. Pam is an activist with the Worker Solidarity Network, which is a community-based campaigners who are working to amplify the voices of workers who are in tough situations with bad bosses, not getting paid, or not having their rights respected. And they've had some tremendous victories. They're also discussed in the paper. Pam, thank you for joining us. Please unmute and tell us a couple of the examples that you've done and what you're trying to achieve to amplify workers' voices.
Thanks, Jim. And I also echo what Jim said. Thanks, Christine. That was so great. Thanks for sharing that. My name is Pamela, also Welsh Territory Acknowledgement as well. I'm calling from the local Algonquin Territory, known today as the Songhees and Esquimalt Nation in Victoria, British Columbia. I'm with the Worker Solidarity Network. We go by WSN. And, as Jim said, we do a bunch of collective actions to improve labor standards for all. And this comes in different shapes and sizes, and I'll share some of those with you. Empowering worker voices is very important. And like Dan and Jim said, it's not a coincidence that workers are speaking up since the pandemic. Workers do have voices. It's not that they don't. It's just that people and institutions aren't listening to those voices. And in that regard, how do we get them to listen to workers' voices? Whether that's a worker telling their employer that they're not being paid all their hard-earned wages, or workers addressing bullying and harassment concerns in the workplace. How we listen to workers or help amplify the voices of workers is by supporting workers with filing complaints, human rights complaints, work safe complaints, employment standards complaints, but sometimes direct action. And the beautiful thing about that and what that looks like is, you know, a group of us with the WSN or the community can send letters to the employer. And that's a simple form of direct action to try to get wages for the worker. Another form of direct action is that the community comes together and signs a petition to support the worker as well. And we've noticed that workers' voices are heard from a collective power when collective power comes into play. And an example that was referenced in the report is that a worker was terminated by text, wasn't paid severance, wasn't paid months and months of wages throughout the pandemic. So the community came together, went to the workplace, signed a petition. It was shared all over the place. And the employer settled extremely quickly. In part, why the approach of worker power and worker voices is important is because currently workers can't wait months or years to get stolen wages back. There are barriers for workers to access justice because there are currently long waits with the Employment Standards Branch to get owed wages. Ultimately, justice delayed is justice denied, and workers are taking justice in their own hands. However, there are systemic issues with labor rights that do not allow workers to have voices. Workers may fear speaking out against violations in the workplace or work rights violated because of fear of repercussion, for example, getting fired. And we know during the pandemic, workers don't want to be punished economically. Or like Jim mentioned, using your voice on social media, but facing repercussion, which means that, you know, we maybe need some better privacy laws. That said, the WSN has worker-led campaigns to raise the floor for better working standards, such as our Get Fired Up about better job protection campaign, or workers demanding for paid sick days. You know, currently right now, workers don't have paid sick days, and they might call in sick and they may be fired for it, for calling in sick. And you can find those campaigns on our website and follow what's next with those campaigns. In this regard, yeah, not to talk too much, because I could also get fired up about this topic, but the WSN builds collective power for change, upholds workers' voices, and ultimately builds community of support that will improve better wages, working conditions, and equality for non-unionized sectors. Thanks.
Pamela, thank you very much. Thank you for what you're doing, and thank you for joining us with your inspiring examples of voice in action. So that's wonderful.